Good afternoon and welcome to our Decarbonising Distillery webinar. We're delighted to have so many of you listening in today. I'm Philippa Hardy, Head of Emerging Technologies at LOCOGEN, and today I'm joined by my colleague and Senior Renewable Energy Engineer, Jack Byers.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hiya.
And owner of ARBIKIE Distillery, Ian Sterling.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Sorry, I haven't put my video on it. Hi there.
Today's webinar is going to be around 30 to 40 minutes, and there's going to be around 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. You'll find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom controls, just on the left-hand side. Please do type your questions into the Q&A box throughout, and we will have time at the end to address these. If you have any issues, you can't hear us properly or see the screen that's already there, then Kim and Derek are on hand to help you out. Please post in the chat function. The webinar is being recorded and the slides will be available afterwards before you ask. The focus of today's webinar is on renewable and low carbon energy options available to distilleries to decarbonise in line with their net zero targets. We're going to start with a brief introduction into the Green Distilleries projects, and then Ian will be presenting ARBIKIE's journey to net zero, and Jack will be discussing low carbon energy options for distilleries and sharing findings from our feasibility reports. We will then end with a summary from our Green Distilleries projects. Before we start, it's probably worthwhile giving a short introduction into LOCOGEN for those of you who may not have heard of us before. So we are a developer and a consultancy delivering renewable energy and low carbon projects. We develop, construct and operate a range of projects for our own portfolio, as well as joint venture projects with commercial and community partners. We also offer a range of services to help our clients to develop their own projects, including technical consultancy services, energy services and asset management. We are actively developing across a variety of technologies, including wind, solar PV, hydro, renewable heat, which includes heat networks as well as heat pumps and the like, storage, hydrogen, local energy systems and EV infrastructure. And we work with a huge range of clients, including SMEs, commercial developers, manufacturing and retail, communities, public sector and lenders. The webinar today was prompted by the conclusion of phase 1 of the UK's government Green Distilleries competition, which some of you may have heard of. The competition provided funding for developing technologies that enable the use of low carbon fuels in a distillery. 17 feasibility reports were funded, and LOCOGEN were fortunate to win 3 of these. And one of these was with ARBIKIE, which is why Ian's joining us today. You can find the full report of all of our 3 and the rest of the feasibility reports on gov.uk or use the link at the bottom of this slide. And we're going to be talking about some of our findings soon. So net zero, what is it? Net zero is really a movement, an environmental movement maybe, that many companies are engaging with. However, there are various definitions, initiatives, commitments and frameworks out there, which is making it quite complex. So to try and keep it simple, net zero is where total man-made greenhouse gas emissions are equal to zero through reduction and removal of emissions. A true net zero solution should focus on reduction and use removals in the short term whilst on a journey to reduce emissions to meet net zero targets. Now, the UK has committed to meeting net zero by 2050, and Scotland has gone one bit further and made 2045 as their target year to meet net zero. These are legally obliging targets, and in line with the Scottish Government, the Scotch Whisky Association has also committed to meeting the target at 2045. Now, generating heat for distillation is the primary source of emissions and a key technical challenge for distilleries, as you're probably well aware. And today, as you can see in the pie chart here, 3/4 of fuel consumption in distilleries is met by fossil fuels. That's natural gas, fossil oils, LPG, CNG. And this really needs to radically transition to meet any form of net zero targets that distilleries wish to meet. So that's enough from me. Let's see what Ian has to say and learn more about ARBIKIE's journey to net zero.
Yes, thank you for I'll very quickly just to give you a quick introduction to ARBIKIE, a discussion, talk through NADAR gin, our climate positive gin, and then talk through the next steps. So in terms of ARBIKIE, we do aim to be one of the world's most sustainable distilleries. We're on a journey and we're making progress through that journey with partners like LOCOGEN. We're a field to bottle distillery, so we grow, mature, distill and bottle on a single site at Lunan Bay on Scotland's east coast. So we have the advantage of being farming for 400 years as a family. So there's a farming base there, and we built distillery on one of our farms that was called ARBIKIE, hence the name. In terms of importance for this discussion, NADAR is key to that because we've created and distilled the world's first carbon negative gin and vodka. We're also distilling Highland Rye, the world's first rye Scotch whisky. This was done roughly about 200 years ago, so it's a revival. It's not brand new, but we're bringing something back that used to happen in the past, which is always great. And we're adopting regenerative agricultural practices and growing all the crops and botanicals that we need to distill. So single estate, just as you would do in wine. That's our approach. That's the way we work. And within that process, energy was basically the next stage of our journey. So hence why we engaged with LOCOGEN. Thankfully, we won the first phase funding in the Green Distilleries competition. And as you can see with the badge below there, we won the Excellence in Sustainability at the Scottish Whisky Awards, beating the likes of Diageo. So a major award for a startup business like ourselves, because we're only 6 years old. So we're at the start of a very long journey because we're building a legacy business. We can try the next slide. So I mentioned NADAR, NADAR meaning nature in Gaelic. So we did this collaboration with the James Hutton Institute and Abertay University. It was the PhD of our master distillery, Kirsty Black. We have a Kirsty's gin named after her, and this was another project of Kirsty's. So in essence, it's saving 1.54 kilos of carbon per 70 cl bottle. So a lot of carbon that's being saved and a world first. So we're growing and distilling the Daytona peas that we use to distill in this process. And the carbon assessments were carried out by Trinity College Dublin and Bangor University. So very much a scientific project and led by science, but also we were willing as a distillery to invest the time in this innovation to make sure it saw the light of day. And now it's being rolled out across the likes of Whole Foods in the US. I think we're in 23 stores so far in Whole Foods in California, and obviously it's available across the UK. In terms of detail, there's much more detail available at the below link, which can talk through the science and Kirsty's PhD. It's all public information, and we're very keen that the industry learns from what we've done, because actually if they were to substitute wheat that most gins are made from for peas, there'd be a substantial difference to the industry. And we'd be keen that the industry did this and it would help with their carbon impact. Next, please. So yeah, in terms of ARBIKIE, we're just continuing our sustainable journey. We're a very young business, so we're lucky that we started in a space where we had farm to bottle was very much our ethos, coming from a farming background, because we were already growing barley for the whiskey industry, potatoes for the potato industry. So we use both of those ingredients for our first vodkas, which we then make gin from. Focus now is turning to very much our packaging and shipping. Key elements within our business as we expand as a business we'll be heading for 20 significant countries by the end of this year in terms of exports. So shipping and packaging is a key element of that. And we have some announcements that are about to come with a new trial that will be happening in the UK very, very soon. We'll also continue to work with LOCOGEN, which will be great in terms of decarbonising the operations and hopefully, we're very hopeful of being in phase 2 of the next round of the Green Distilleries project. Fingers crossed, because we've enjoyed working with LOCOGEN and we'd like to continue because it's a key part of what we want to do. As you can see in the picture on your screen there, there's the distillery on the right-hand side, and that's the new distillery experience, which we're currently building and refurbing the inside. So that'll be available to book for guests probably by the end of this year. We'll probably do some corporate events by the end of this year, and that'll allow people to come on site, learn about field to bottle, touch, feel and taste all the crops and everything we're doing. So people will get to know that ethos. And, you know, as I said before, we'll be exporting, it'll probably be well over 20 countries by the end of this year with the progress we've made. And ultimately, we will launch our single malt whiskey in around, as an 18-year-old, probably just after 2030. But being in the whiskey industry, it's a decades and centuries business, and that, you know, we're making steady progress as a 6-year-old business. So thank you for your time, and I'm willing to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And yeah, as Ian said, he's sticking on the webinar, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. So please feel free to address your questions to Ian as well as us. Time now for a quick poll. To make sure you're still with us. There's a lot of people on the line, and it'd be great to hear from you before we go on. And what we want to know is, what are the main obstacles to decarbonising your site? Is it the people and time? So is there not enough of the right resource, or the resource full stop, to investigate these options? Is it something to do with the technology options? Maybe you're unsure of the best technology or the most suitable, or aware of alternative options. It's cost and finance, so that could be the capital cost or securing finance or any other implications to do with cost. Installation disruption, obviously changing fuel and energy and whatever else is going to require some change on site. You're worried about the disruption on your operations. And then there's operational concerns, so maybe there's quality assurance issues, maybe you're worried about making changes that will impact the quality of your project. And then we've left a 6th category on other, and we'd love to hear if for anyone that's ticked other, what are those other things that are key obstacles to decarbonising your site? So we'd love to hear all of that. And we will address the results, but it looks like we've got a minute in there. So it looks like majority of people today are ticking cost and finance, which is not a surprise, and something that Jack is going to touch on just now. So hopefully I'm going to hand over to Jack, and he's going to talk about the low carbon energy options and address the sort of cost and finance issues.
Yeah, hi, thanks Philippa. Hopefully that's as I take control, a seamless transition. Yeah, so as you already mentioned, heat is the largest carbon emitter associated with distilleries, and the distilling process itself accounts for over 3/4 of overall energy usage for distilleries. Now, we appreciate different distilleries have their own kind of modifications of the general spirit making process, but we can generalize that with this simple schematic, which shows thermal energy applied at the wash and spirit stills. And of course, thermal energy is also applied in the mashing process prior to fermentation. Now, conventionally, in the vast majority of cases, this thermal energy is applied via steam, and this is raised in a boiler with a burner attached, which burns either natural gas or oil. So what we want to focus on, therefore, is how we displace this reliance on fossil fuels with new technologies and energy sources. So there are many potential options to decarbonising distilling, and we split these up into 3 broad categories, namely hydrogen, electricity, and bioenergy. It's worth noting that these options listed are not necessarily exhaustive, but I think it's fair to say that they are the most prominent, and LOCOGEN have experience of looking at all of these. So we're going to focus in this presentation on hydrogen, high temperature heat pumps, and thermal storage, all on the back of our green distilleries work. So the following slides will discuss the relative benefits, some considerations, all drawing on our real project experience. So we'll kick off with hydrogen, considering that's what we've been investigating with our co-presenters, ARBIKIE. Specifically, of course, I'm talking about green hydrogen. So that's hydrogen created via electrolysis, where the electricity has come from renewable sources. The combustion of hydrogen is very similar to that of fossil fuels, whereby you need a burner and a boiler. And a big benefit of this is that these components are commercially available already. So that's the burner, the boiler, compression and storage vessel. And burning hydrogen is capable of reaching the same temperatures with the same ramp rates as the fossil fuel it would be displacing. There's also a relative simplicity in retrofit, whereby at worst you would have to replace your existing burner and boiler. That means that downstream of the boiler, there's no change to the process in making the spirit, and therefore no impact on the end quality. Hydrogen can be created from renewables, as I mentioned, from electrolysis, and this can be from on-site renewables. And this will inevitably lead to an excess of hydrogen and oxygen byproduct, and this can be sold to third parties to generate a further revenue stream. Now, undoubtedly, the biggest consideration if going down the hydrogen route is supply of green hydrogen. As I've just described, this can be created on site through renewables, but this requires land, it requires development money, time and expertise. So you would need a third-party developer such as ourselves to get involved at that stage. You could import green hydrogen from elsewhere, but you need to be assured that this is a steady supply and at a reasonable price, and there's no sort of national established supply chain for this at present. You would also have to store hydrogen on site, and although this is perfectly safe if done correctly, there are strict protocols about the distances of hydrogen from other objects, and that includes other fuels and maturing spirit as well, which is rather important for this discussion. So a consideration that feels often overlooked, especially if you're, well, only if you're making hydrogen yourself through electrolysis, is that you need a pure water source. Now, obviously, distilleries have their own water source already, but you need to make sure that the water required for electrolysis does not compromise the water required for actually making your spirit. So with ARBIKIE, we looked at the feasibility of completely displacing reliance on gas oil. So that's coming up with a 100% hydrogen solution. Therefore, the project capital for that scenario is very high, but that includes the wind turbines, the ground-mounted solar, the hydrogen burner and boiler, compression, storage vessels, and all the mechanical and electrical integration that goes around that, as well as all the planning and development works. The end result, though, is a huge cost saving of over £3 per litre of alcohol produced, as well as enormous carbon savings. Now, you can read more about this, of course, in our publicly available reports, but just a bit of additional information in that we conducted a thorough constraints mapping exercise at ARBIKIE. So this is with the view to maximising the on-site generation and then optimising the size of the storage to make sure that we could provide the greatest quantity of hydrogen for within a viable business case. So our modelling showed that to provide 100% or near enough 100% hydrogen, you would end up with a significant excess of hydrogen. Therefore, we looked at available local and regional hydrogen markets and found that these would be accessible to us. There is a slight potential due to the intermittency of renewables that you would need some backup for less than a percentage of the time. Therefore, we recommended that the existing boiler and burner system is retained to ensure resilience in the overall energy system. So we'll move on to thermal storage now, and as part of our Green Distilleries work, we investigated the Lumenian high temperature heat store in a new build distillery in North Uist. Now, this heat store works by importing electricity and then heating up the storage medium and then dispatching this as process heat. And we found that the dispatch heat was at a temperature more than capable for distillation and could be dispatched with at a rapid ramp rate and very high efficiency. And because this is run on electricity, it can be integrated with renewables. This could be on-site renewables again, but also with perhaps curtailed energy from existing wind farms, for example. And this is an important additional benefit, as a lot of distilleries are located in remote places where this heat store can actually help overcome those grid constraints. Due to the rapid response rate of the heat store, it's also capable of participating in grid balancing services. So we partnered with Flexitricity to look into this, and you would require an aggregator such as Flexitricity to take on the management of this asset. So you could use them to optimize the heat store so that your running costs are minimized as much as possible. So you're using energy when it's cheap, basically, from the grid. Now, this is a new technology and it's not been tested in a distillery setting yet. However, as part of the feasibility, we engaged with Scottish manufacturers to see if this could be developed and installed, and we didn't see any barrier here. However, from our modelling, despite optimization, the energy costs for the heat store are still higher than business as usual fossil fuels using today's electricity and fossil fuel costs. However, it does manage to displace completely reliance on business as usual fuel oil. So we'll move on to high temperature heat pumps. For the benefit of those who might be unfamiliar, conventional heat pumps extract heat from at ambient temperature from the air, water or ground environment and use electricity to boost the temperature of this heat source and deliver it normally for space heating. A high temperature heat pumps works with the exact same principle. The only difference is that the heat source is at a much higher temperature. So it's been extracted from another process, for example, from a waste heat from a distillery. The main benefit of a high temperature heat pump is the efficiencies and the massively reduced energy demand. And this is particularly the case if you integrated it with heat recovery within the distillery as well. And because this again reduces the demand so much, it can actually act as an enabler for other low carbon technologies, as well as a solution within its own right. A large consideration is that the high temperature heat pump would require retrofitting of existing distillery processes. So that is something to bear in mind. And also it is likely that a backup source of energy would be required to kickstart the process and also needed potentially as a temperature booster. So we've worked alongside the Green Stills Consortium on a number of these projects, and we looked at the feasibility of Green Stills high temperature heat pump system and found it to be technically feasible and also offer a viable business case and substantial carbon savings, it could also be integrated with other low carbon and renewable technologies and attracted grant funding as well. So we can generalize the relative benefits of different options, but really it comes down to site specifics and circumstance. So for honest carbon emissions, that is wholly dependent pretty much on where you're getting your electricity from, for example. And that, of course, has a knock-on effect on your operational costs. If you're installing on-site renewables, obviously your capital costs are going to increase. It's worth noting as well that these options aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. They can be combined to provide a more optimal, holistic overall energy system. What has become apparent from our years of looking at decarbonising distilleries and the wider process heating industry in general is that unfortunately there is no one size fits all. We need to be conscious of the technical risks as well as possibilities. For example, is there land to install renewables on site? We also need to be cognizant of any financial implications. So the renewable heat incentive and the feed-in tariff are no more. So how do we work with the distillery to create a viable business case? Is there grant funding available, for example? And finally, we must be mindful of the product. So is the distillery creating a high value single malt where increasing the cost of a bottle by 50 pence isn't so much of an issue? And in fact, being able to brand that as a green product may actually boost overall earnings. But of course, we need to also be assured that any solution isn't going to impact the product quality, and also future-proof the distillery so that they can be able to keep producing their product into the future. So with that, I will hand back to Philippa to complete the presentation.
Thank you, Jack. So yeah, as Jack mentioned, I'll just finish the presentation with a bit of a summary into our green distilleries projects. So through these green distillery projects, we've demonstrated that the distilling process can be 100% decarbonised, which will greatly support distilleries on their journey to meet their wider net zero targets. The technical and financial feasibility for doing this is variable, depending on the many factors that Jack has just very nicely summarised. But our work with ARBIKIE shows a great example of where this does work. So we achieved a £3 per litre of alcohol saving, more than 4 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per litre of alcohol, and that equates to around 800 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. To be transparent, this is based on some grant funding to support the capital cost of the hydrogen system, since the financial feasibility can be difficult for greener options due to the higher cost of electricity compared to oil and gas. However, that will change. And distilleries, like most industries, do need to think long term. So what we've done here is taken some publicly available data on fuel, oil and electricity costs. And we've modelled the cost of these fuels out to 2050 for 3 different technologies: a hydrogen boiler, the thermal store, so aluminium thermal store, and the high temperature heat pump on the right. So regardless of the technology, you can see the orange line is fuel oil and the teal line is electricity. And completely independent of the technology, you can see that fuel oil is expected to increase. So whereas it's low today, it will continue to increase, and around 2040, it's expected that electricity costs will reach parity and then decline below the cost of oil. And really, to achieve net zero, this is going to have to happen. It doesn't really matter when, if it's 2040, 2030, or somewhere between the two, but it's going to have to happen as we need to move away from oil and gas. The purple line in all of these graphs represent the cost of fuel for the low carbon technology options. So that's hydrogen and electricity. And you can see that this is, in some cases, already lower today than the equivalent oil cost. And that's mainly due to the higher efficiency of the new technology, as well as the lower fuel input cost. So for example, for ARBIKIE, we're using renewable green electricity from solar or on-site renewables, solar and wind. So before we move into our Q&A, some final thoughts. We think there are, from our green distilleries projects and our wider work with distilleries and other industries, there's three key takeaways really. Firstly, as Jack's already mentioned, there is no silver bullet in terms of switching technologies. There are many options available. It's going to be bespoke to your site, and all technologies have their own benefits and considerations. So a feasibility study is required to select the most suitable technology for your site. Financial feasibility can be difficult for new tech due to the higher capex cost and the very low oil and gas kind of benchmark costs, especially for electrically driven new technologies. However, this isn't always the case, and there are exceptions. Also, the running costs of new technology can also be lower, even with today's costs. And finally, with the price of electricity reaching parity with fuel oil in 2040, adopting low carbon technology today is a long-term strategic choice. And what's more, early adopters can benefit from grant funding. So proactive companies that are seeking new solutions today, whilst there's grant funding available, will stand to benefit. And the Green Distilleries competition is an example of the type of funding that is available. And we've been very successful at LOCOGEN at securing grants and helping our clients to get funding for these sorts of projects. And we're happy to help you and work with you on this basis. For all those attending the webinar today, we are offering a free informal call with one of our experts to discuss options for your site. So whether you have a distillery or a different site altogether, feel free to contact us directly, and our details on the screen. But hopefully that's given you some useful insight into the various energy solutions that exist for high temperature processes more broadly. But now we've got about 10 to 15 minutes to answer your questions. We've got a couple already, so keep them coming through, and we'll use the next 10 minutes to ask your questions, and it can be for Jack or Ian. I think I'll kick off with a question for Ian to get him back online. Ian, from an ARBIKIE perspective, what do you think other distilleries should be doing right now with regards to net zero?
In reality, working on it, because the sooner you do it, the better. From our point of view, we're building a legacy business, so it's better to build it in as soon as we can do, just as you spoke about, because you could wait, but if you wait, it may not be possible to do it. We'll look at all the options, and I think everyone else should do the same, because I think the distilling industry should be leading on this and addressing it. And I'm sure, you know, that as you spoke about the SWA, there's a lot of, you know, giant steps being taken, but there's a lot of work to do, and it's a very important industry for Scotland in particular. So we are keen to push ahead because we're doing it on all fronts, and you know, it's important, fundamentally important to us, but also I think it's fundamentally important to the industry, having worked for a number of distilling companies in the past.
Cool, thank you. And looking at the questions we've got coming through, Jack, there's a question on the installed capacity of wind and solar being installed, I believe, with regards to our ARBIKIE site to provide the hydrogen needed. I believe that was published.
Yeah. It is all in the publicly available report. However, it was 3 megawatts of wind and I believe 1.5 megawatts of solar and a 2 megawatt electrolyzer. So a substantial system to provide 100% hydrogen scenario. The next phase of this project, however, is looking at a demonstrator scale. So that wouldn't be that size of installation. We'd be looking at a megawatt of wind and a smaller electrolyzer to prove that the system works. And from our modelling, that provided roughly half of the energy demands for distillation. And then we'd expand the system over time after that.
Cool, thanks, Jack. We've got a question from Alan. Will it be possible to use this technology in a city environment?
I'm not sure which technology that would be, but we could talk in general terms. Well, from the top of my head, the city environment, obviously you're more constrained for space. Also, if you're developing renewables, that is also a lot harder. So yeah, there's no doubt about it, it would be harder. If you're a new build distillery, it makes it a bit easier because you can incorporate, for instance, the high temperature heat pump scenario. There's no additional space really needed if you're starting from scratch. If it's a retrofit, then you would need to think a bit more carefully. Perhaps the thermal store is quite I suppose, a neat solution in that case. But yeah, definitely further considerations, I think, and would require a bit of thought and looking at the specific site and its individual constraints, I think, in a city setting.
Cool. We've got another question on the solution for ARBIKIE from Matthew. So heat recovery and high temperature heat pump seems like one of the best options. Which technology with ARBIKIE go for? Now, I think the answer to this is, for the purpose of the Green Distilleries competition, the project that we had with ARBIKIE was solely looking at hydrogen, not necessarily all the options. Do you want to just expand on that, Jack?
Sure, yeah. So for ARBIKIE's specific case, I think Ian and his brothers are blessed with well, the land available because it's a working farm, as Ian's mentioned. So it made sense to look at how we can develop some renewables on site, first of all. Secondly, it is already an operational distillery. So as I mentioned, yeah, the high temperature heat pump and heat recovery is a very valid option. However, it does require retrofitting. So the beauty of the hydrogen solution for ARBIKIE is the relative ease that you can slide in hydrogen burner and boiler alongside the existing one, and then you can pretty much operate as usual. As I said, downstream of the boiler, nothing changes. So that lovely picture you see on your screen of the ARBIKIE stillhouse, that'll all be the same. It'll just be steam running.
Cool. And then there's a few questions coming in that I think would be great for Ian to provide a response on. So John is asking, how do we incentivize businesses to accept a longer payback of around 12 to 20 years when traditionally people wouldn't often look beyond 3 to 5 years? Ian, have you got any comments from a business perspective to add to that?
Yeah, ultimately, the Green Distilleries competition was government funded. I think it's where government has to prime pump in terms of people making that change. So, they want industry to become more green. They're setting targets, so they've got to help people along the way. So I think they have to encourage the kind of things they are doing with the Green Distilleries competition, but others need to come in terms of funding needs to come, demonstrator sites need to come, people need to get on board. And, I know Zine Palmer there's asking a question about tail wagging the dog. Fair point. I think, the utility companies have to come to the party as well, because there must be opportunities for people right across the board in terms of providing the power that distillers need, because we don't necessarily want to become a utility company either. But it depends on, as Jack said, every scenario is different. Ian's probably in the middle of Fife. It's maybe easier to do there than where we are in the middle of Angus, but every scenario is different. And I guess the selling of hydrogen out to other parties, will be a consideration. Bringing hydrogen in is a consideration. We're blessed that we have land to do some of the renewable work we want to do. So I think, as we've said right through, or you've said right through the presentation, every scenario is different. But to answer your question, I think it has to be government funded, because they need to move these projects into reality. And the date that's been set seems a long time away, but these things take a long time to do.
Yeah, it's creeping quickly along, isn't it? And with Scotland being 2045 and loads of the local authorities here, aiming for 2030, 2035. So that's only 10 years away, actually, if you're in the Glasgow region maybe, or other regions in Scotland that are a bit more ambitious. And yeah, we are seeing that grant funding coming through to support these new technologies that are going to need that CapEx funding. Whilst we've got you, Ian, another question that's probably more one for you. So it's around claims of net zero. How can a product ARBIKIE's products claim to be net zero, given the nature of manufacturing, bottling, packaging, transport, global export, disposal, etc., etc., etc. So how do you kind of, yeah?
Well, it's not. I mean, in that's the reason I referred to that web, the web address that was in, because that details the project down. So that details the work that Kirsty, our master distiller, did with James Hutton Institute, with Abertay University, and the carbon assessments from both Dublin and Bangor. So the detail is there. That was scientists that did that. It wasn't me or our family or our business. That was independent scientists who worked that one out. So the details published in a public space, and if you can't find it through that one, we're happy to supply that, because it's a published paper and it's Kirsty's PhD. And I think, so in reality, it's not a claim, it's backed by science, and these people put their reputations to that. Whether it's Graham Walker at Abertay University or Pete Aynett at James Hutton, there's people named all the way through it, and that's what they do.
Great stuff.
I would just add to that as well slightly, that we mentioned in the presentation that the majority of energy requirements at distilleries is from the actual distillation, and that includes that whole product life cycle of the warehousing and the maltings and everything. So obviously it's not the full picture, of course, and you need to look at everything else. And actually, in terms of the manufacturing, like glass and everything, what we're talking about with distilleries is quite applicable to wider industry as well. These solutions are not unique to distilleries. It's what we're talking about today, but can be applied in other industrial settings as well.
I think also we are very fortunate to be growing what we're distilling. So actually, in terms of bringing those materials on site, most of them are grown in view of the distillery. So we have a huge advantage there. And also for the waste that's coming out, we're recycling that back onto crops or into animals. There's a whole load of lovely Highland cows that are now recycling all the draff and everything else. But it's a serious point, and it's the way farming's always been, is that we'll always recycle. And hence in the last slide, my comments about packaging and shipping, that's another focus for us, because obviously as an exporter, you're shipping stuff around the world. And so we need to address that, and we are addressing it, and we'll announce some stuff within that space fairly soon, because we'll address as many elements as we can do as a responsible manufacturer, if you want to call it that.
Great. And again, in the reports for all of the green distilleries projects and that we've done with our partners who are named on the screen just now, as well as the other, 17 in total reports. So there's a lot of learnings out there that are readily available, public. Go and have a read on gov.uk, and the link was in the slides earlier on. And another one to look when we talk about net zero, science-based targets as well, is a great website to check out for that. There's another question from Peter on why solar PVT has not been discussed. I think obviously limited time, we at LOCOGEN look across all low carbon technology options. So if you want to chat about any of the technologies, feel free to just get in touch with us and we'll be happy to discuss that. We're always on the lookout for new and innovative technologies as well. And with the sort of funding rounds that come through, they're often looking at new ways to do things, like the recent Bayes long duration storage call. Let's have a look. Loads of questions coming through. This is fantastic. It's great to see so many people interacting and having lots of questions that hopefully we can answer. So we've got a question on high temperature heat pumps from Sarah. So in the case of retrofitting a high temperature heat pump to a working distillery with limited space, what would be the expected footprint for a booster and backup required? So I guess it's a space concern.
Yeah.
Jack, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, in terms of, if I heard that correctly, the footprint for the booster and backup, that would be either your electric boiler or your conventional fuel burner. So not enormous. I mean, obviously wholly dependent on the size of the distillery and the ton per hour of the boiler. But yeah, not huge, but if you're struggling for space, then you can run into issues for sure. But I would, if you want to get into specifics, I would defer to the Green Stills Consortium, but we're happy to have the conversation and be included in there. But yeah, I'd be happy to get in touch and talk about the site for that one.
Great stuff. And Ellie's asking, are more government grants coming out for distillery decarbonisation? And if so, what's the best way to find out about these? I think it's fair to say that phase 1 is now closed and there were 17 reports, and they will announce shortly phase 2, and that will be based on the select few from the feasibility will be taken forward to the next level. Jack, are you aware of any new phase 1 type funding rounds coming through for distilleries specifically?
Not specific to distilleries, unfortunately. I think I think that pot of money's kind of, well, it's ready to be spent. However, there are constantly more sort of grant pots coming out. We're actually, I mean, it's a good thing, but at LOCOGEN we're kind of swamped from time to time with imminent grant applications with short notice. So yeah, to stay on top of them, I suppose, just ear to the ground, and just, I mean, we're obviously signed up to various feeds to get this information, and I think it's an important thing is to start these conversations early. So for instance, with our work with ARBIKIE, I mean, we talked for the first time quite a few years ago, and we're looking for the right opportunity to come along. So when this came along, we were ready to basically pounce on it and act on it, and thankfully deliver a successful project. So I think that's the important thing at the moment, is to have those conversations, think about what could be done, and keep your eye out for the right grant funding that comes available, because there's a lot out there. Yeah, you just kind of have to be on your toes.
So key takeaway, get in touch and tell us about your site, and if we see a funding pot that becomes available, we can certainly have you in mind. There's definitely quite a lot coming out of Horizon Europe at the moment that we're in the UK it's still eligible for, and there's plenty of high temperature heat process grants and things like that available. So yeah, feel free to get in touch, even just for an informal conversation. Should probably just find a couple of final questions. I don't want to kind of at the 10-15 minute mark. There's a query on the green hydrogen costs and why these were much lower than energy. It's from Anonymous. I think that was the graphs we showed at the end, and that was because the hydrogen is being produced from on-site renewables, I think is the key takeaway there. So that's difference. Right, one last question. So yeah, cost of high temperature heat pumps has expensive running costs. It's more of a statement than a question. Jack, I guess the main thing from the graphs we've just shown is efficiency of high temperature heat pumps is higher than alternative that might use oil and gas. I'm not sure if that's in relation to hydrogen or to PVT, but have you got any comments to add to that?
I would say from the work that we've done, it can be cheaper than a fossil fuel alternative already, and that includes heat recovery. That's the crucial part. Of course, the price of electricity is 4, sometimes 5-fold that of fossil fuels at the moment. So you do need an efficient system, and incorporating the heat recovery into that does reach your cost parity.
And then I'm going to have one last one for Ian. So there's Kenneth is asking, at a time when distilleries are reducing their water usage, is there a concern about the volume of fresh water required to produce hydrogen, especially during the summer months and climate change? And I guess maybe it's a bit to Jack from a technology point of view, and Ian from an operational point of view.
I think, I mean, from an operational point of view, there's always a risk of that. Thankfully, Scotland naturally gets a lot of water, so it should be less of an issue. But again, it comes back to every location, and every location will be different in terms of freshwater sources. So I think operationally, you're either in the situation you're in or you're developing a site. So it's another consideration to take into account, is needing that fresh water, as Jack said during his presentation. But, you know, we are where we are with anything like that. And it will be another consideration. But running these sites and doing all of this is incredibly complex with so many factors, and increasingly so many factors, that's why we're working with someone like LOCOGEN, because you're working with people whose expertise we don't have, but we want, just to make the site run better.
Yeah, not too much to add to that, to be honest, Ian. I think you've covered it. But yeah, I think it's a good point actually, by the questioner. Yeah, it is. It could be a concern for a specific site. It just depends how much water they have available, frankly. So we need to just assess that on a case-by-case basis.
Cool. And then maybe just to wrap up, conscious of time, maybe just a final thought from the both of you on net zero, green distilleries, anything to leave the listeners with? We'll start with Ian, maybe.
From my point of view, I would be lobbying government, both in the UK and in Scotland, in terms of their funding of these projects. We can wait for grant funding, but you can also lobby for it. So I'd be lobbying for it. Because it's incredibly important. If we're talking distilling, it's an incredibly important industry for Scotland and the UK. So there's no reason why it shouldn't be getting more funding, particularly if the politicians want to move this forward at G7 and at COP26. Put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, I would echo that completely. And I think, touching on something I said earlier, distilleries, you could see it as a microcosm of the wider route to having to decarbonise industry. But what distilleries have is that kind of wider social value, being such a high employer, particularly in rural areas in Scotland, and a huge exporter and contributor to the economy. It has something to offer there, as well as just a kind of a legacy thing as well. So yeah, I think it has to come basically a point where these low carbon options are the default. At the moment, it's grant funding, and that is required to get things off the ground, get demonstrators in, show that these options actually work, and hopefully that will create some momentum. Yeah,
awesome. I think my summary is net zero by 2045 or 2050 or whenever it is that people decide when it's going to be, and it's probably going to draw closer and closer. It is happening. It's a not only environmental movement, it's social, political, economic movement, but it's here, it's happening. Businesses are already on board. So I think it's just a matter of getting involved. And if you need help with that, we're obviously here to help. There's plenty of other companies out there also doing lots of different things. But if you want to speak to us, find out more about energy options for your site, grant funding, or any of the other things we've mentioned, please do get in touch. We'll follow up with the slides, a link to the Green Distilleries report so you can find publicly, and feel free to contact us or give us a call. We're more than happy to have a chat with all of you. But for now, that's all we've got time for today. And thank you so much all for the amazing amount of questions that came through, for your attention, and just for listening in. It's been great to have you on board. And so, yeah, hope to hear from you all soon. In the meantime, have a lovely afternoon or evening, wherever you may be. Thank you very much.
Cheers all. Bye.
Bye.